All right, so we're now recording. So yeah, as people are trickling in, I don't want to start too late, so I will start introducing the subject and introducing the speakers today. Thank you all for joining for this hopefully inspiring and very thoughtful conversation about our local air quality. I do have a few things to discuss before we get officially started with our speakers. So you're all currently muted, or you should be, but feel free to leave your cameras on. As I was saying, we love to see who's in the room. It's also more interactive for the people that will be speaking today. So I will share my screen and show you the agenda for the next hour. Oh, where did that go? There you go. We're going to start with a kind of a Q&A session, an interview between Jake Cole and Beth Gardiner, who I will be introducing both of them just in a few minutes. We're going to move to discussing the results of Ecology Ottawa's Breathe Easy campaign with Robbie, who's also on the line that I will introduce shortly. And we will have a brief presentation, an introduction about Sierra Club Canada's air quality monitoring here in Ottawa as well. And we will finish with open floor to questions from all the attendees at the end of the webinar. So joining us today are Jake Cole from Sierra Club Canada. He's leading the charge on the air quality monitoring campaign and has been a great help in planning this event today and the Breathe Easy campaign more generally as well. Beth Gardiner is currently joining us from the UK. She's an author and journalist from the United States originally. Her work appeared in publications including the New York Times, The Guardian, National Geographic, etc. These days, she focuses mainly on stories about the environment, health, and sustainability. She just published her first book, Choked, in 2019. And today she's here to answer our questions with regards to her book and more specifically, her research and interest for air pollution. So I would invite all the attendees, all the audience to purchase her book if you haven't already. The book is a great resource for people like me who are not scientists. Beth was able to take the abstract numbers and statistics about the impacts of air pollution and make it feel way more personal. Her ability to put a human face on this issue was incredibly compelling, and I urge you to support her work. Finally, Robbie Venice, PhD candidate at Carleton University, is here to speak to the results of Ecology Ottawa's Breathe Easy campaign. He was and still is a central part to the project. He monitored the air with volunteers, ferried the monitors around to other volunteers, and he spearheaded the data analysis and even wrote parts of our final report. So you'll hear more from him shortly. And so for now, I would like us to move on to our questions and answers with Beth and Jake. I will unmute you. Are you able to unmute?
Yes, sorry, a little slow there.
Okay.
Yes, I'm unmuted too, I assume.
Great, yeah, we can hear you. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Beth, for coming virtually to Ottawa from the UK to tell us your story, or your stories. It was, when I got this book and read it for the first time, I was so taken by something that on one side was a scientific journal with references and for every claim and statement that was made in the book, but probably more so excited because it reads like a novel with dramatic writing skills and everything put together into it. So it's a real treat to read, and every time I read it, which has been several times now, I learn more, I get more excited, and I get, in some respects, more scared because of what is happening around the world, and some of the stories you've described around the world are partially happening here in Canada, and maybe it will be happening worse if we don't do something about this subject. And so we don't want to be choked. We want to live long, healthy lives, and I'm sure your book is going a long way
for sure
to get us there. So I just have a series of questions just to try to let the audience know a little bit about you and the book. The book it's got many messages that run through it. But if you look back on the book and thought about what are the key messages that come out of that book that all of us should really know, what would those key messages be?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess the first one is the key message is really the thing that motivated me to write this book when I started to realize it, which is how profoundly air pollution affects our health. It's something that's kind of hidden from us in a lot of ways. There's always this word invisibility that's used around air pollution, not just that you can't often literally see the pollution in the air, but that we don't see the connection between cause and effect. The science is very clear that if you breathe air pollution for, years over the course of your life, your risk of all different kinds of health problems, from heart attack and stroke to multiple cancers, dementia, diabetes, et cetera, the list goes on, is elevated. But, you can't see that connection in usually any individual case. So, the reason that I really wrote this book is that I started to understand that in London, where I live. I've lived here for about 20 years. I came from New York originally. And when I first got to London, this is sort of a roundabout way of getting to the takeaway, but I always noticed this sort of thickness in the air and kind of fumes, and I would get like a little bit headachy when I walked down a street in London, which was not something I had ever experienced in New York. No one really ever seemed to be talking about it. So I kind of pushed it to the back of my mind. But a bunch of years later, I was working on a story that was related to when the 2012 Olympics were coming to London, about sort of air quality and the athletes. And that, in the course of doing that, I spent, started with just a few minutes of Googling the science of air pollution and health. And really my jaw just dropped after about 2 minutes of doing that, because I'm sure what you find if you start reading some of that science is that there's really an overwhelming body of evidence linking dirty air not just to immediate health problems, but to long-term health problems over the course of our lives. And I think the two things that shocked me were the sort of scale of that impact. So, you see these numbers globally. Dirty air is linked to 7 million premature deaths every year. In the UK, where I live, it's somewhere around 50,000 deaths annually are attributed to air pollution, premature deaths. I'm sorry, I don't know the number for Canada off the top of my head. For the United States, it's around 60,000. So, that shocked me. And as a journalist, it really struck me as sort of a really important story that wasn't being adequately covered and wasn't being well told, and therefore was not and is not, I think, sufficiently understood by the general public. So to me, the most important takeaway is the thing that drove me to write this book, which is kind of, wow, this is affecting our health so much more than we realize, both in terms of the scale of the impact and also the variety of the impact. Like I said, everything from heart attacks and strokes to premature birth, dementia, diabetes, just an incredibly long list of illnesses that are linked to air pollution. So that sounds a little bit bleak, but I guess the other takeaway message is this is actually super fixable. It's not an impossible problem. We can fix it. We have made huge progress in so many places. I tell the story in the book of the American Clean Air Act. And I know that Canada has made similar progress in terms of clearing its air over the last sort of 50 or so years. But in the US, this very powerful piece of environmental and public health protective legislation has just been a sort of slow, steady march of incremental progress, right? Over 50 years since 1970, when the Clean Air Act was passed. And in that time, the US has reduced air pollution by around 70%. And the scientific analyses demonstrate that those improvements, far from perfect for sure, but tremendous progress, literally has saved millions of lives in 50 years since 1970. And not only that, but trillions of dollars. And the benefits have been dozens of times, 40 times over was one estimate, the costs. So I think that's another really key message from the book, that, you know, this is fixable when we sort of carry forward. It's really kind of dull and unsexy, but basically science-based regulation backed up by good enforcement. You know, good enough doesn't have to be perfect enforcement. This gradually clears the air, and that, you know, brings almost immediate health benefits. And just to add quickly two other things, another really important takeaway from the book is that air pollution and its impacts are very, very deeply intertwined with really all the sort of fractures that exist in our societies, and particularly economic inequality and racial injustice. So the way I put it in the book is that, you know, dirty air affects everyone who breathes it, but it affects some people more than others. And I think that we're going to hear a little bit about this later when you guys share your local monitoring results in Ottawa, but it's really true, you know, almost everywhere you go around the world, that air pollution tends to be worse in communities of color, and it is worse in poor communities. And by the way, those things are independent of each other. So even, well, this is true of the US, I don't know the statistics in Canada, but in the US, those things are independent. So even wealthier Black communities have higher levels of air pollution than poorer white communities. So you have both economic inequality and racial inequality sort of, you know, intensifying the impacts of air pollution. And then the last thing is probably also obvious to most of you, which is that this is very much interconnected with the climate crisis. You know, separate in many ways from it. And in my opinion, anything that kills 7 million people a year around the world would be worth a book and worth our attention on its own, even if it were not interconnected with this, you know, existential danger to the future that we face. But in fact, it is interconnected with the climate crisis. So, you know, it only adds to the urgency, in my view, of dealing with this problem. So I think those are the big takeaways.
Thank you, Beth. You mentioned some personal things in there, and it reminds me that as a child, I lived outside of London in Purley, and later on in Hendon.
Yeah.
As a teenager, I remember going downtown and then coming home, and my collar of my shirt would be black all around it, and I would.
Yes, everyone says that.
Some of the personal experience you described in your book. So talking about personal experiences, I know in your book, and I love the way you make the reader feel like he's right in there with the room or in the area where you're speaking with the various people you interview. Yeah. And so you feel like you're right part of the story. But if I had to ask you, which one of those sort of personal experiences with an individual really seemed to hit home with you? Is there one that sticks out in your mind?
There's one that sticks out in my mind that's actually not in the book. But it's a story of air pollution activism and an activist that I've met actually since I finished the book, that I'm going to tell you about instead. And it's a woman, this is a woman in London named Rosamond Kissy-Deborah. She really has an extraordinary story. And I, you know, like you say, I did try to focus a lot on human stories in the book, both stories of people impacted by pollution, but also people, you know, activists, people trying to do something about it, because that it really does make a difference. And in so many places I went, I met activists who's just been plugging away for years and, you know, have really helped to bring change. But the story of this woman in London, and she's really now, Rosamond has become the UK's, I would say, highest profile and most important air quality activist. She lost her daughter very tragically. Her 9-year-old daughter, Ella Kissy-Deborah, died in 2013. She had a very severe form of asthma. Rosamond, the mother, was a secondary school teacher at the time, and she didn't know anything about air pollution. Ella was sick for about 2.5 or 3 years, in and out of the hospital dozens of times. She had great medical care. But the doctors, no one ever mentioned air pollution. London is a very polluted city, and the Kissy Deborah family they still live. I was there actually a couple of months ago interviewing her for another story I'm working on. They live just off of one of the busiest and most heavily trafficked roads in the city called the South Circular. Rosamond didn't know anything about air pollution when Ella was sick. No doctor ever mentioned it. But after she died, she started to learn a little bit about air quality. And there was a scientist from the University of Southampton who came in and did an analysis and found that almost all of Ella's hospitalizations coincide, including the one that ended with her death, coincided with air pollution spikes in the neighborhood. So Rosamond has since become an air quality campaigner. And the way that she's done that is that she is actually, it's actually a legal fight that's been going on for years, and it's culminating this week and next because she's appearing in a coroner's court this week. She decided that she wanted to get air pollution written onto Ella's death certificate as a contributing factor to her death. And there had been an inquest right after her death. So it's been a very protracted legal process. She was backed by the Attorney General of England she had to get a new inquest authorized, and that inquest is happening this week. If she is successful, this will be the first ever British death certificate, and it may be the first in the world, no one really knows, to have air pollution written on it as a contributing factor. It's gotten really widespread media attention in Britain, sort of every step of the way, every legal increment of this battle. And, obviously you can understand why it's such an awful story and so heartrending, the death of a child. And Rosamond is just an incredibly passionate and incredibly knowledgeable and powerful speaker. And in her view, obviously she wants this for her own, some sort of closure for her family to have air pollution acknowledged as the true cause of her daughter's death. But, she also understands that there is something much bigger. And, this idea of putting a face on a problem that is sort of, as I was saying earlier, an abstraction. Ella's case was a very rare case where, usually the way it works, right, is that in a cleaner city versus a more polluted city, you'll have X higher rate of heart attacks, X higher rate of strokes, but you'll never know who those individuals are, right? If I have a heart attack tomorrow, no doctor is ever going to say to me, oh, it's because you breathe polluted air, right? I also eat junk food and I don't go to the gym enough. But in a very rare case, and this appears to have been one, you can actually put a finger on it. And I think Rosamond really understands that there is something very morally powerful, politically powerful, symbolically powerful, emotionally powerful about, if she is successful, writing in black and white on a legal document that this city's and this country's, and actually Europe as a whole, has a really serious pollution problem, killed this child. Because of course that begs the question, who else is it killing, right? How many other children? And Rosamond is very explicit about this. She wants to stop this from happening to other families in London and beyond. So like I said, I only met Rosamond after I finished writing the book, but it's an extraordinary story. And if you keep an eye on the BBC or whatever, she's expecting a verdict in the next couple of weeks.
You've got a website, Beth. Can people go to the website to find out more about that story? BethGardiner.com?
Yeah, if you search back a little bit on my website and previous writings, I wrote a New York Times op-ed about Rosamond's case. I think it was January last year, 2019.
Okay. You had a number of statements in your book that really hit home with me. One of them was this, where someone told you this one: if you see someone get run over by a car in the street, you'll never forget it for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
1,000 people died from air pollution over the last couple of months. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's it. And
that's the way it is for everybody, I think. How does that work?
Well, it's partly what we've just been talking about. You can't see it, right? So that's partly why this case of Ella Kissy Deborah is so powerful. But I think there's maybe also a complacency around this issue, that people don't really understand that it doesn't have to be this way. there's a sense, I think, in which people, if they do learn a little bit about air pollution, maybe sort of shrug and say, well, it's the price of driving cars. It's the price of, modern society. It's the price of prosperity, what have you. But I think we really do ourselves a disservice with that. And, one thing, I mean, obviously we really need a leap forward now where we move off of fossil fuels, these dirty fuels that are poisoning our bodies and our planet as well. But even short of that, even before you move to, wind and solar and get off of gas and oil and coal and all of that, actually, regulation works, right? And regulation is when government exercises its power to prevent corporate polluters from, saving money by not cleaning up their mess, right? So, which is just to say that it's not inevitable, right? I mean, you can even have big trucks and ships and the exact infrastructure we have today with tighter regulation, where you require those ships to have, better filtration or to use cleaner fuel. You require factories to, manage their emissions, and you will get cleaner air. So, and obviously the more significant leap towards clean energy is very possible as well. So, yeah, I think it's just important for us to remember that this is not inevitable. We have made a lot of progress. We still have a long way to go, though. This is still making us sick. It's still killing people, and we don't have to live with it. So I think that's kind of the other half of of that quote of being shocked if you see someone get hit by a car, because they didn't have to, right? It's a tragedy. And I think with air pollution, we need to see it more clearly, and we need to understand that it doesn't have to be this way.
Okay, that's great, Beth. I'd love to just talk to you for hours here because it's fascinating to hear your stories. But I'm going to ask you just to sum up a bit of what you've already said to some extent, but also to leave us with some messages that we can take home today, that things that we can do to improve the air quality in our own areas. You've already given us a number of suggestions, and those are ones which we can follow. But tell us some from your book. What were some of the hopeful things that you saw out there that we can relate to and perhaps bring home here and do right in our city of Ottawa?
Well, I mean, like I said, I just was so inspired and impressed by the stories of the activists that I met, people in, Krakow, Poland, people in China, people in India, people in, LA, people in London, all over the world. These are not overnight victories, right? But I mean, I met people who've been fighting for years and years. I met an activist in Long Beach, California, which is right next to LA, and lives in a neighborhood with a huge container port and a lot of fossil fuel oil refining infrastructure. This guy's been fighting for 20 years for cleaner air in his neighborhood, and he's won a lot of victories and lost a lot of fights. But overall, things have gotten better gradually over time. So, I think part of the message is that, one thing we can do to personally clean up our air is less about sort of, what you do with your own kind of personal footprint, right? I mean, that's great if you can ride your bike instead of driving, or buy an EV instead of a fossil car. But, I think what you're doing, in terms of political activism, that's a personal action too, right? And even if it's a long, slow fight, I've just seen so many stories of success around the world. It's really inspiring. And I guess the other thing is just to sort of, the other side of what we can do, I guess, is protecting ourselves. And part of that is what you've been doing, sort of monitoring. There are now pretty inexpensive handheld portable air quality monitors that are on the market. And I've had scientists tell me, pay attention to your route, right? That you can't change the overall air quality in your city, But what actually makes a big difference is, where you travel and the air that we each as individuals breathe in. No one breathes a citywide average, right? So, being mindful of that. If I'm out walking or riding my bike, or especially if I'm running, exercising, I'll go out of my way to walk along a route that is less trafficked, because it actually makes a really big difference. You can reduce your pollution intake by as much as half. And I'm especially aware of that if I'm with my daughter, because children are more vulnerable. But even if I'm by myself, it's just much healthier. And the only other thing I'll say is that one thing that really surprised me researching this book is that wood burning is very, very polluting. So whenever anyone asks me what they can do to make the air cleaner, please don't burn wood in your fireplace or home log burner. They're sometimes marketed as being like eco-friendly or carbon neutral, climate friendly. They're really not, unfortunately. And in addition to that, they are wood smoke is, may feel sort of cozy and natural, but it's actually very high in all kinds of toxins, and it's got a lot of PM 2.5 tiny particle pollutants, which are really dangerous to breathe in.
Well, Beth, this has been great, and I said I could listen to you for hours. We do have a chance for everybody here who would like to ask you something later on, so we're going to
Sure.
get back to you then and give you a chance, I'm sure, to chat a bit more about your book, about some of your thoughts and some of your suggestions for us to keep healthy and keep this air clean.
Sure.
Back to you, Emily.
Thank you, Jake and Beth. Thank you for sharing, Beth. I definitely enjoyed your talk, your presentation. My main takeaway is definitely a message of hope. So that's really great. I think we can often focus on just how bad our air quality is, and that it's very hard to make a change. But as you said, the change is not going to happen overnight, and we just need to keep on, focusing on political activism. And I definitely agree that we will see a change eventually. So thank you for the inspiration.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
So Robbie, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to allow you to unmute. Robbie is going to present the results of our data analysis, of Ecology Ottawa's data analysis. So we monitored the air quality with over 150 volunteers in August and September. And so we've just completed the data analysis, and Robbie is here to present the major results and the major takeaways.
Okay, thanks so much, Emily. So as mentioned, my name is Robbie. I'm a PhD candidate from Carleton University in environmental engineering. And I've been quite deeply involved with the Breathe Easy campaign since the beginning. And so I'll go over some of the details today. And so if you could switch to the methods, please. So as Emily mentioned, over 150 volunteers were engaged in this program, which I actually learned recently makes it one of the biggest citizen science programs in Ottawa, which is really, really cool. And those volunteers measured air quality across 21 locations in the city of Ottawa, which were each subdivided into 2 sites and all measured 4 times individually. And so these locations were chosen based off of the populations that are regularly attending institutions there. So places like primary schools and seniors care homes and other types of similar areas where sensitive groups may be residing regularly were prioritized in the choice of locations. And ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and particulate matter were the contaminants of interest. And once all the data was collected from the volunteers, it underwent a 2-stage cleaning process to essentially ensure that the data that we were actually analyzing was representative of the measurements that were taken by the volunteers. And at the end of all of that, the results were compared with WHO guidelines for short-term ingestion, which I'd like to just emphasize right now is really important that these guidelines are based off of 1 hour of ingestion, meaning that the concentrations need to be ingested for that full 1 hour to have the negative impact that the World Health Organization describes. And the data that we analyzed, each measurement lasted between about 2 to 15 minutes. So what the results that we're presenting that I'm about to share are not to say whether they are compliant or non-compliant with WHO guidelines, but rather those guidelines can act as a benchmark for evaluating how much our air quality within Ottawa was varying based off of the measurements that we took. So if you can move to the next one, please. So here are the sites that we chose. And as you can see in orange, the site A's are located near major roadways, whereas in purple with the site B's, they're located 1 to 2 blocks away, often in a residential neighborhood or in a nearby park or something like that. And the intention here was to really try to isolate if those major roadways were having an impact on overall air quality and what happens if we were just able to move away from it. And so if you could move to the next one, please. There were 4 really key findings in this study. The first most important one probably is that air quality varied significantly by geography, meaning that there was significant difference between the measurements we took at certain sites in comparison to others. That trees proved to have a positive impact on air quality, but were not eliminating pollution. That truck traffic had a positive and significant correlation with particulate matter concentrations, and that ozone proved to be the most concerning contaminant. And by concerning, I mean that of the measurements we took that went over WHO limits, the vast majority of them were caused by ozone. So for the purpose of time, I'm just going to focus in on the first 2. So Emily, if you could just move along. So we're going to focus on the first 2, and then starting with just the first one on the variability. The first thing I'd like to show is the map of the average ozone concentrations that were measured in this study. And so you can see there's a scale which are each divided by the 10th percentile. And really, I mean, in this map, there's a lot of information, but the key thing that's important to recognize is that there are significant differences between the average values that are measured depending on the locations where they were. And as you can see in the top inset, there's really it seems to be some degree of clustering. Unfortunately, the geographic spread wasn't actually significant enough to do a statistical analysis and determine if those clusters are significant, but observation does demonstrate or suggest that there is certain clustering within the city where air quality is worse in some areas and better than others based off both the variance of the measurements that were taken, as well as the dependence of those measurements on locations nearby. And the geographic spread was further found when we compared with the current official measurements taken by the province of Ontario in Ottawa. So you can move to the next slide, please. So this graph is a little bit confusing, but it shows 2 things. First of all, it shows the Breathe Easy measurements in the purple diamonds. And this is comparing the percent difference from the average measurement taken overall in the month of September with the individual measurements that were taken on the day, as well as the percent difference for the official measurements that were taken by the province. And as you can see in a number of spaces, particularly like at the beginning, for example, of September, you can see that our trend and the trend observed by the city of Ottawa do overlap in a number of times, which indicates that our measurements were representative of what was being measured, or roughly representative of what was being measured by the province. But what's really interesting about this graph is the areas where they don't overlap, particularly if you look at September 5th, or I think it may be September 4th, where our data was far different from the average in comparison to the municipality. And the number of variations that are really seen here indicates that because our measurements were spread across the geography, whereas the province's measurements are only in 2 locations that are relatively close together, we can say with relative certainty that there is an amount of geographic variability that's not being captured by the municipality in their daily averages. And so if you could move to the next slide, please. So all of this together kind of highlights some interesting and important things. So first of all, we note that the contaminant ranges went from 0 to 293 for ozone and similarly high values for the other contaminants. And for reference, the WHO guidelines are 50 parts per billion for ozone, 200 parts per billion for nitrogen dioxide, and 25 parts per billion for the particulate matter, where it's less than 2.5. I think it's nanometers. So what's interesting here is, first of all, our particulate matter concentrations never reached those WHO limits, which is really critical and really important because those contaminants can cause a lot of health challenges. But with the other two, we did see a diversity of times where the concentrations went above that WHO limit, which is suggestive that the air quality in the areas where they were measured may remain at those high levels. And the other thing that's interesting is that we found a lot of variance between and within sites, which again kind of comes with expectation, because when you see this variation, air quality moves around a lot, and so you would expect to see that variability. But the fact that we're seeing consistently high levels at certain sites that were leading to these very high concentrations suggests that the variability between the sites was rather significant, and that again, the two air quality monitoring stations that are currently used by the municipality and the province are likely not capturing the amount of variability in the air quality across the city. And so that brings us to our first policy proposal, which is to regularly and accurately monitor air quality, specifically throughout the city. So again, with the provincial measurements, they're really high quality measurements, and they're certainly trustworthy, of course. But what we're finding is that they may not be capturing this amount of variability that we're seeing. And as us on the project, are interested in seeing further investigation into whether those outcomes that we were seeing of these high levels on the days where we monitored the air quality to be rather high, we want to see what type of, whether that impact is really significant and if it's leading to intra-city marginalization, specifically in terms of areas that are zoned relatively close to certain public services like bus routes, highways, or parks, for both positive and negative relationships. And also can allow for health-based zoning laws if we have more information and understand more about the amount of geographic spread of that variability. And the second finding to talk about is the trees. And so this finding was based off of our measurements when we compared Ottawa's Arboretum, which is a highly tree dense and an open green space area, with the measurements that we took from the rest of the city. And as you can clearly see, the Ottawa's Arboretum had average values that are significantly lower than the rest of the city, which can be contributed to two factors. First of all, that the Arboretum has significant tree cover, but also that it has some sort of distance from roads, meaning that distance may have some sort of filtration effect. But the next thing that I really want to emphasize here is when you look at the standard deviation, you can see that with ozone, the standard deviation is roughly on par with the rest of the city, but the standard deviation is much lower for both nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter. Again, which makes a lot of sense because the latter two are secondary pollutants, meaning they're directly reactants, or they react directly with primary sources, whereas ozone is tertiary and takes a little bit extra time to produce and therefore lasts in the air for longer. So the fact that we're seeing higher variability in the Arboretum with ozone rather than the others aligns with expectation and further emphasizes the fact that just being away from a road or having trees is not eliminating air pollution, but it is leading to significant changes. And that's further emphasized by the fact that the site B had much higher concentrations on average than the Arboretum, even though it too was far away from the high volume traffic roads. And so what this really brings is that the tree canopy is believed to be the most influential aspect that led to these differences, but still did not eliminate that pollution, and further efforts are definitely needed to reduce pollution from the source rather than just planting trees as like a Band-Aid, for example. But that brings us to our second policy proposal, which is specifically, again, similar to our first one, to attain a tree canopy of 40%, but more specifically on a per neighborhood basis rather than a municipal scale basis. And the important part about that is that when you have citywide targets, it's very easy for those targets to be overlooked in terms of the intra-city marginalization that can occur. And we know within the city of Ottawa that there are certain areas that have more sensitive and marginalized populations who may be subject to less investment in terms of tree canopy simply by virtue of the geography versus, for example, being closer to roads and more densely populated areas where there's literally just less available space for those trees to be planted, and makes it a lot easier to invest in areas where there's more open space already. But if we focus our investment on making sure that these targets are citywide and located with specifics to the individual neighborhoods, we can hope to get that same positive impact that we saw from the Arboretum across the city, to making sure that we are not perpetuating any marginalization or inequities that may already exist. And so in summary, this was a really, really awesome program, and I feel really grateful to have had the opportunity to participate in it and be a volunteer. And there were so many volunteers that I met with and I spoke with personally who were really just motivated to know what the air quality was like in their city. And I think that really speaks to the demand that we have in the city of Ottawa for really high quality monitoring and an improvement on the communication on what that monitoring leads to with our citizens. And as Beth spoke to really importantly, which I think is also important and what we've discovered too, is that the relationship between environmental policies and health policies are really one and the same. And what this study has shown is that the point source pollutions do have a significant impact on us, but at the end of the day, we should be discussing our environmental policy and health policy within the same framework, and they should be communicated within the same framework rather than these independent and possibly competing policy initiatives. And the biggest thing that I really have to say is that this presentation really only covered a very small amount of the amount of work that went into this report and study in general. So when the report is available, we definitely highly recommend that everyone take a look and read the findings in more detail. There are more policy proposals, much more detailed discussions on the methods and the statistical methods that were used in order to analyze this data, as well as some more details on what the findings actually mean and the implications that they have. But if you're even more interested, you can see my email and Emily's email in the next slide. And I'm happy to speak with anyone who's interested in learning more about what we did. Even the report doesn't necessarily contain all of the details of the findings that we've been able to have because of simply the ability to contain it within a reasonable document in this presentation. So I will make myself available to anyone interested who wants to learn more about the analysis we did, what the data really means, and most specifically, really what you as an individual within our city can do to advocate for better air quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robbie. That was very interesting. There are so many questions in the chat looking for more information from you. So I'm sure you'll be receiving a couple of emails, but we'll try to get to some in the Q&A. So Jake, I'm going to unmute you. If you want to present Sierra Club Canada's air quality monitoring project.
Okay, am I still visible to be seen?
Yeah.
I just want to show everybody what we were using both Ecology Ottawa and us, this is what we're using. This here is called an air quality egg. And this is a solar battery that goes with it. This is basically the kit that we go out there with. It's pretty easy to carry this stuff around or even carry it on a bike. And it tells you immediately what the numbers are that you're seeing out there. Our project was similar to Ecology Ottawa's in respect where we're trying to measure hot spots and other spots and then compare it to what the sort of government ratings were. But we've only just got started doing our monitoring. And so I've only got some preliminary findings to show you. But I'll tell you a little quick story that got me going on this when we first got the project approved. And when we got funding from, and both Ecology Ottawa and us got funding from the Ottawa Community Foundation to allow us to do this work. And we certainly thank them for their I guess their purpose in letting us go out there and do this on behalf of the city and try to get information back that the city and the people living in the city can benefit from. So the very first thing that I did when I got my air quality egg was I went down to Bank Street near Lansdowne on a pretty hot summer day, and the traffic was pretty heavy, and I found readings there for PM 2.5 that were in the 20-25 range. And to give you some context to that, the number that we're talking about here with PM 2.5, it's actually a diameter, and it's actually about 1/100th the size of a human hair. So it's quite small. And some of the smallest particles that we can see through a PM 2.5 meter are particles that actually can go from your lungs right into your blood, right into your brain conceivably. So these little particles can be very dangerous. And in our work, we decided just to use PM 2.5 as our marker, just because for two reasons, I guess. It's easier to look at just one piece, and it seems to be one that is probably maybe most significant when it comes to health impacts. And also in terms of our system, our air quality egg, it seemed to be the element that it read more accurately, and that was based on lab results from different labs across the world that have tested all these small handheld systems. So when we went out to check out our project and check out where the hot spots were, the first thing we did was go down to the Ministry of Environment. Their station, which Robbie referred to, was down on Wurtemberg Street in the east end of Ottawa, just where Rideau Street crosses over into Vanier. And we checked out our meter there, and the readings were about 2 to 3 on the PM 2.5 scale. And again, confirming what Robbie was saying, in Canada, a safe rate for PM 2.5 is on a 24-hour basis would be something less than 25 per day, 25 units per day. And on an annual basis, if it's higher than 10 per day, that's considered also an unsafe area to be in. Well, when I went down and took our egg to see if it was working well, the readings right at the site were 3 or 4, which happened to correspond to what the readings were on the Ontario site. Then we walked along Rideau Street, and the readings there were 3 or 4 or 5 times that amount. So right away, we realized that there were hot spots in Ottawa, and that people, while they're vaguely aware that these might be out there, they don't really know. And if all they're doing is reading the air quality results from the Ministry of Environment's readings every day, it looks like Ottawa is pretty good. And in general, it is. But for 500 people who die prematurely in Ottawa every year as a result of air pollution, obviously those numbers are not very good. So we've discovered just so far, and this is just a quick list of some of the areas that we've seen where the PM 2.5 rates are in the 20-25 range. There's a West End industrial site off Carp Road, right near the Queensway interchange, just north of the interchange. It's a Carp Road and Richardson Side Road, a pretty heavy duty industrial site with there's a dump there for one thing. There's a quarry there for another thing. There's a concrete plant for another thing. There's a waste recovery site. There's welding shops. It's quite a concentration of various industrial sites. And the readings there were really quite bad. And luckily, there's not a lot of people living right around there, but there are a few commercial enterprises where people are working and people are eating there with the restaurant. So it's something to be concerned about. And I'm sure that people who go there don't realize just how concentrated that pollution is at that particular site. There's a school in Stittsville, And I went to where they drop off kids at the school. 39 buses go through this little one area and drop off kids right in front of the school. So I went right down there where the kids were coming off the buses. And there again, the PM 2.5 numbers were in the 20 range, 20 to 25 range. The person who was there greeting the kids, the school monitor, she was there. I told her what I was doing. She was interested. I said I'd get back to her with the results. But there's not just her, obviously, but these kids getting off the bus. And every time a bus would come in, you'd see that the readings would go up a little bit. 39 buses went through there. Curiously, I went back to that same area without the buses. That area was very good. The PM 2.5 readings were fine. Costco parking lot in Canada. Now, I just thought I'd go there just for the heck of it. And sure enough, right at the front entrance to Costco, results were PM 2.5 ratings in the 20s. Downtown Parliament Hill, downtown Rideau Street area. Those are areas that there's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of tall buildings, including condos where people are living. So it's not just an area that's remote. And there's construction happening there, a lot of heavy trucks. In those two areas, the results were in the 20s again for what we saw. Again, on a one-off basis, if that was just there for a couple of hours, probably you could deal with it, but that's probably pretty consistent along those areas. Bank Street at Lansdowne, I already talked about that earlier. That was another area in the summertime when it was quite high. Montreal Road and the Highway 174 interchange is east of Ottawa proper. Just a really busy interchange, a lot of construction going on. A seniors residence is right near there, again, high ratings. A rural farm in Manotick. And there's actually farm areas in Manotick where farmers are cutting down the forest to make more fields. And some of these farmers are just burning the brush, burning the cut trees. And that can create a real mini kind of pollution storm. And our tracker out there has found areas there where we're looking at what looks like just smog. And it probably is effectively smog from all these wood fires. And I relate back to Beth's comment about wood fire stove. Wood firing, bush fires are not good for us. And even as we know about wildfires in the western part of the US can actually come over and affect us ultimately. So that's just a quick summary of what we've done so far. We're continuing to come up with a little more information. And what we want people to walk away from our project is that, yes, there are bad areas out there that we should know about, and people should know about these things. We think the government, whether it's the city, the province, or even the country, should be making this information more aware to citizens in Ottawa. And we hope our little project is going to get us there. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you, Jake. I'm excited to see where this project will take Sierra Club Canada, but also Ottawa more generally. So I've seen a lot of questions in the chat, and there is no way we're going to get through them all within the next 6 minutes. So we might go a little over. If everyone's okay with that, you can leave at 1 p.m. if you need to, but the recording will be still active, so you could check in on the questions you missed on YouTube afterwards. So I've noticed a few that were particularly interesting to me, and now I've lost them. Just give me a second. Okay, so Julia, I think, asked, Robbie, did you see a relationship between air quality issues and vulnerable communities? I know you spoke to it a little bit. Did you want to add some information there?
Sure, thank you. And that's a really great question, and something that's obviously really important for the city of Ottawa, especially in developing policy around air quality. So for the purposes of our analysis, we didn't actually do necessarily a geographic distribution to analyze air quality in certain areas. So, but in general, all of the locations where we chose did have vulnerable groups that were consuming air quality, and especially in areas where those concentrations went above WHO limits or even went above the average, did demonstrate that. And we saw, especially around like the downtown area closer to Byward Market, we did see the elevated contaminant concentrations in that area in comparison to the rest of the city, which again kind of aligns with expectation because of the higher degree of car traffic that's moving around there, as well as the significant amount of construction that's happening. So particularly in terms of the particulate matter concentrations. But in terms of the specific demographics, we didn't include that in the analysis, but our work does suggest that in every location that we measured, there are vulnerable groups, particularly vulnerable from a health perspective to consuming contaminated air quality or air, and our results do definitely demonstrate that there are problematic areas within the city that have a correlation with the locations that this air was monitored.
If I may add here, thank you, Robbie, for your response. We're hoping to do a second campaign next year, Breathe Easy 2.0, and we're hoping to add this consideration within the realm of our study. Beth, did you want to comment on that question as well?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it may be difficult to know specifically what you've got right now in terms of your data, but certainly, you know, that would be typical in many big cities, that the places that you see that have higher concentrations of pollution are going to be poorer communities and often communities of color. I mean, you can just see very logically that, you know, rents and housing prices near a area with heavy trucking or, you know, a lot of traffic, or an industrial facility or a dump like Jake was talking about, those are going to be the cheaper places to live, right? And sort of conversely, you know, there's also a dynamic where those kinds of communities, and particularly communities of color, often less politically empowered, become sort of easier places for, you know, companies to site unappealing facilities, whether they're, you know, trash incinerators or power plants or whatever. So that's definitely a, you know, a really important dynamic. And I just think that the kind of work that you guys are doing is really, this is really the cutting edge of air pollution science right now. You know, years ago, pollution would be sort of measured and talked about as a citywide average, right? Like London annual PM 2.5 level is 12. Ottawa is, you know, whatever it is, I don't know. But, you know, that's not useless, right? Like you can compare between cities. If I told you that Delhi was, you know, 180, I'm making that number up. I don't know, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it tells you certainly that it's, you know, orders of magnitude larger than European or North American cities. But nonetheless, there are tremendous, you know, varieties within a city. And as you were talking about earlier, and that can really be masked by this idea of sort of one number that's an average. So really the cutting edge of air pollution science now is what they call microenvironments, right? No one breathes this average. We all live where we live, we work where we work, we travel between those places. And that is what dictates our sort of individual pollution exposure. So there's a you know, a lot of interest now in much sort of finer bore monitoring, like what you were doing. And, you know, obviously in a lot of cases that is going to illuminate really significant inequalities. In Oakland, California, there was a monitoring project being done, and they found a difference of a factor of 8 just in the space of one block. I can't remember if it was PM 2.5 or NO2 or which pollutant, but, you know, you can really have tremendous variations based on, you know, pretty short distances apart. So, you know, I commend you guys for this work, and it's really important. And, you know, it's exactly where the scientific interest is right now. So it's definitely the right thing to be doing. And I think also politically, one thing that I saw in a lot of parts of the world that I traveled to is that monitoring and data and information is really the first step towards change, political change. It's not enough, but it's, you know, it's necessary as a place to start. In China, for example, it's a country that has made really massive progress on air quality, still has a very long way to go, but they've made huge reductions in their PM 2.5 in recent years. And it started with monitoring, because once people start seeing those numbers, you know, and I encourage you to share them and get them out as widely as you can, you know, it helps people to understand that, you know, that there is a problem. And that's the first step towards changing things, I think.
Wouldn't mind throwing
Thank you.
something here from some things that I've seen here in terms of where do we go from here. I noticed a couple of Canadian experts in this area are on the line, and Greg Evans, the University of Toronto researcher, has done a lot of work in this area. I'd consider him one of the experts in Canada on the area, and I hope he's doesn't mind me mentioning his name. Might get a flood of calls, but he's one of the experts. Luke White from Environment Canada here actually in Hull or in Quebec. Gatineau is another expert online here, and he's done some really interesting work in this area. We certainly look to him for advice as we run our project. And I noticed a number of questions here from whoever Win 10 is. That sounds like an expert in the audience, and I would love to contact and talk with you a little bit more, because you clearly have some insights into this whole project that we could all benefit from.
So unfortunately, my internet crashed, so I lost the chat, but I do remember one question from Jennifer that was asking about idling. I don't know, Jennifer, if I could unmute you and you could repeat your question, because I lost it.
Right. My question really is, and I'd like Beth and maybe Jake as well to address this if possible. Given that, we do know that vehicle idling is generally unnecessary for more than a minute or two in typical circumstances, why is it so hard to impress upon people that they can make a big difference by turning off their engine?
I'll take it first. Yeah. Okay. To me, it's just a habit. As far as I can tell, people just don't do it. As you know, they make cars now, so it does it automatically, and that's nice. But I know that people just don't do it. Some people might think it hurts the engine, and I've heard that argument from sort of auto nuts who say that no, that's hard on the engine, shouldn't do it. Well, from what I gather, it's not, especially when the engine's warmed up, it's not hard at all. In fact, after car shuts off automatically in many of the new models, it shows that that's the way it is. But the whole school thing really drove it home for me. And incidentally, there's another project we're doing on the side over in Gatineau at a school, where one of the mothers of children who go there is looking at air pollution, and buses and a big sort of a lot of traffic in our area plus buses really contributes to the problems at that school and many schools. And when I had this project where we saw that in Stittsville, 39 buses are coming in, I talked to some of the drivers afterwards. Apparently they do not have to turn off their trucks or their buses. I asked them, don't you have to? No, we don't have to. We do it as a courtesy, but we don't do it, and in the winter time, maybe we won't be doing it because it's cold sitting there in the buses, all the kids start filing in and out. So there's a perfect example of how just a habit, more or less, becomes standard procedure. And to break that habit seems to require a law, as opposed to just people will just do this naturally. Well, they don't, because they've never done it before.
Yeah, I was just going to say one other thing about that too, which is I think, I certainly you're absolutely right that, if you're standing or walking or sitting right next to an idling vehicle, that's going to have an impact on the air that you breathe in, and that is not pleasant. But in some ways, I also feel like, I don't know, it's kind of making me think of like this whole anti-mask thing, right? Like, I don't know, I get so angry, if I go into a store or something. It happened to me just yesterday, and I see these people without masks, and I just like want to scream at them and tear my hair out, right? And yes, of course, that person shouldn't be doing that. But I think sometimes that it becomes, almost personal. It becomes focused on an individual, but actually that individual action is speaking to a larger systemic failure. And in both of those cases of the the mask, people not wearing masks, and the idlers, it's a failure of public communication, I think, of public health communication, and I realize like it doesn't help me, right? If I get steamed and I shout at that person who's not wearing a mask, it's the same, right? Okay, maybe the driver will turn off their engine, but as soon as you walk away or tomorrow, they're going to do the same thing, right? It needs proper enforcement. It can't be about you versus that person. It's a larger issue. And I remember there was some stuff in the chat earlier about wood burning fires, and it's the same thing, right? Like, it's very politically difficult to challenge wood burning fires because, you know, people like fireplaces. And if it's just me kind of shouting into the wind at, you know, people who are making my street smell like smoke or idling their trucks or whatever, that it feels futile, and it needs to be addressed at a higher level, whether that's with I think like a public health education campaign, so people understand, you know, it's not just about, you know, the fact that you want to charge your phone in the cab so you keep the engine on. You know, you're actually literally having an effect on people's health who are around you. The same with the fireplaces, the same with the masks, right? And it has to be about enforcement. Those people need to know they're breaking the law, and there's a chance of, you know, getting fined, right? The same way that guy's not going to leave his truck parked in a no parking spot because he's afraid of getting a ticket. It should be the same, right? If it's just us all as individuals trying to enforce on each other, it's just A, it doesn't work, and B, it just leads to sort of acrimony and finger pointing and arguing rather than actually effective action. I'm not telling you not to say anything. You should, of course, but, you know, the fact that you have to is speaking to a larger systemic failure, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with you that it is a public communication failure, and we have the perfect opportunity right now with COVID because, you know, air pollution, you know, COVID, you get it worse. There's a lot of research on that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So I don't want to keep everyone too long. So I think we can answer one more question if the panelists have time. There's a question from James Birch. Can we identify activities in the high pollution areas so that we can better quantify factors contributing to the problem? So we can say there's a lot of traffic or there is some industry, but how much? So how much is dangerous, or how much should we be concerned about, I think is the question. Does anyone want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an idea called emissions inventory, right? That if you want to clean up the air in a city or a region or a province or whatever, you need to know where the pollution is coming from. And what that is going to vary depending on where you are, right? So if you're in a city with a lot of traffic, truck traffic and buses, it's going to probably largely be, you know, building, energy, home heating. It's going to be trucks. If you're in an industrial area, it's going to be a different mix. If you've got a coal power plant, you know, that's going to be the source. So it's going to vary is the answer depending on where you are. But it's really important for, you know, a government body or a regulatory agency that's trying to clean up the pollution to know what it is so that they are targeting the right thing. And it's never just one thing. You know, it's not like there's one answer to air pollution, one silver bullet. It's a lot of things, right? Agriculture is actually a really big source of particulate matter and other pollutants in a lot of places because of all these different, you know, chemicals and manure and things on the farm are off-gassing ammonia, and that combines with other pollutants to form PM 2.5, right? You need to deal with that. You need to deal with the power plants. So it's not just one thing, it's a lot of things, but, you know, understanding what they are is an important thing, and that needs to be done through scientific study.
Something that's,
sorry.
if I can throw it in, Robbie, just give me a sec here, would be, while you may not have access to one of these all the time like we do, although we have been talking about lending these out to people, or if people want us to come by and take a reading at their house or near their neighborhood, I think we can arrange that. So please let us know. And if we can, we might be able to do that for you just as a public service. But if you don't have one of those, you've got this thing on the end of your face, which is actually a great little monitor. And if you can smell something particularly an exhaust smell, or even a smell that smells nice, but doesn't seem right or doesn't make sense, what's this coming from? The chances are you're getting some bad air. And in our little study that we've done so far, where we got the bad readings, it was areas where you could either see or smell smoke. And this is a dead giveaway where the ratings would go up, and you could tell. It's not always that way, as Beth says in her book. Quietly poisoning us is really the outcome of some of the things that are out there. But in our looking at some of our hotspots, where you have a lot of congestion of traffic, where you have high buildings around that are sort of holding the pollution in and into one area, where it's not too windy. Another thing that can actually make a bad area seem okay, at least temporarily, as the wind can blow it away. And when you were seeing a lot of people doing things with little motors, it's also going to be another bad area. It turns out that a lawnmower, a regular fuel-fired lawnmower, creates as much pollution as 8 cars driving at highway speeds. Wow. As many as 11 cars driving at highway speeds. So next time your neighbor is out with his lawnmower and it smells a bit, go and tell him about that. He might hate you, but he probably wouldn't even know that.
And if I could just give one more extra piece of information, in that within the report that we actually detail, and one of the findings that we had was that there was a 57% correlation between particulate matter concentration, or PM2.5, and the number of trucks that drove within 2 kilometers of each of the sites that we measured. And so the fact that first of all, that we saw a significant correlation with any individual finding is quite fascinating, because there's such a diversity of ways that particulate matter can enter into the air. But simply the fact that we found this correlation, and it was significant, really does demonstrate how truck traffic is having a particular impact on the Ottawa air quality in terms of the particulate matter, specifically within the high traffic areas in the downtown core.
Thank you, Robbie. Okay, so I think we will wrap it up. We're 15 minutes over, so I don't want to keep everyone forever. I will share the report of the findings, as well as my contact information, Beth's, Robbie's, and Jake's. So if you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to anyone and ask further information. I'm just sharing in the chat now, again, the 30% discount on Beth's book, Choked. You can get it at that link specifically. I don't know that you can copy and paste from the chat, but I can send it in the follow-up email as well.
It's a great book. I gotta just throw that in. It really is a good book. I was so impressed. Every time I read it, I like it even more.
So I will share the recording. I've got some comments from people saying that they wanted to share this webinar with other cities, people that aren't here right now. So I will be sharing the recording. And thank you all for attending. I was really pleased with the number of attendees today. And I'm happy we're getting the word out. So thank you to all the panelists who took of their personal time to participate. I really appreciate your time. And Robbie, again, thank you for all the data analysis that you did to make this project happen and this presentation happen. Beth, thank you for sharing all your expertise and taking the time today to join us. And Jake, thank you for making it all happen as well. And to all the attendees, thank you for your time. Have a great day, everyone.
Let me throw in here, if I can. We're going to do another webinar probably just after Christmas. So stay tuned. We'll be back with some more news and some other experts who we can speak with and get some great questions and answers. All the best to you.
Great. Pleasure to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Beth, can you stay on for a sec?
Yeah, sure.